The first case that you and I were discussing earlier, it came about, it would have been about 2013. I was contacted by a gentleman who, when he was very young, he recalled a day when he was about 3 or 4 years old. This would have been in the early 50s. He was standing at a large window in his apartment building looking down, and he had been forbade by his parents from going near the window. But he went out and he was looking out the window and waving at people below when he suddenly got a sense that there was someone standing behind him. And he initially thought it was his mother, and he turned and saw what he recalled being 5 very small, bald children. And that's the way he had described them to me initially. And I asked him, do you mean they were actually small children? He said, no, but as a 4-year-old, that's what I thought. I thought they were just bald children. He said, but over the years, as I aged, he said, looking back, I realized that they may have been something other. So we began investigating the case based on that. He said he never had any other sightings before or after. And so I began looking into the possibility of a family connection. Sometimes we find that these phenomena will follow a family generation to generation. So I asked him about his family, and he assured me no, his family was quite ordinary. He was sure that his mother had never seen a UFO, and he didn't think his father had. And so then I started thinking maybe it had something to do with what the parents did for a living. And I asked about mother, and no, she was just a housekeeper. I said, what about your father? And he said, well, my father was in the military. And that, of course, made me start to wonder. So we investigated that a little deeper and found that his father had started out in World War II as a bomber pilot, flew many, many missions during the war. And then after World War II, was briefly severed from the military, and then during Korea went back in and became a career military man. Well, none of that sounded necessarily interesting, but I still thought there could be a ufological connection somehow. So I continued to do the investigation, and I pretty much came up with nothing. And I asked him one day, I called him up, and I asked if he had anything at all that could help me check on his father. And he said, certainly. He said, I have all of his military records. So I drove up to Wyoming to meet with him and to look at his military records. And initially what I was presented with was a large leather case that was pretty much every single piece of information that his father ever had received as a military man. And I realized immediately this is far too much information to look at that point. So I asked the gentleman, could I just take a few sections, a few files? And he said, no, take the whole thing, just take care of it and get it back to me. So I took the case of documents home with me, and I started looking through them to see if there was anything that might suggest a ufological connection between he and this experience he had as a young child. And while I never found anything directly connecting the two situations, what I did find about the father was fascinating. It seemed that in this case, he had all of his father's documents, including records of his flights during the war when he was a bomber pilot. And I took some of those records and I started doing Google searches, and that's when the mystery really took off. What I found was, whenever I would take a situation with this gentleman, the man's father, and enter it in, I could find exactly the same information that I found on his father's records, with the exception that his father had been removed from every situation. Whether it was a bombing mission that I could find where it gave the aircraft number, the date, everything exact as on the flying records, including the other crew members. But in every case that I could duplicate, which was not many, but the ones I could duplicate, his name was removed. On the Google searches, he was not mentioned. Sometimes there'd be another person entered, and it was not always the same name. This became very curious to me, so then I started going deeper into the gentleman's career after he came back during Korea. And I found that he seemed to have been someone who basically was a writer. He authored many documents for the United States military, not just the Air Force, but several different branches. He had authored papers or documents which dealt with how enlisted men and officers should interact. All sorts of very, not technical, but very detailed instances of simply how they should react, protocol, if you will. And there's nothing there that would make me think anything unusual. But the gentleman kept turning up in interesting places, such as I found that he was later at Walker Air Force Base, which had previously been Roswell Army Air Force Base, or yes, Army Air Force. When he was at Walker, they renamed Roswell, he was a nuclear missile commander while he was there. During that time, several of the nuclear missiles had been deactivated under his watch. Then later, before he retired, he was at, I believe it was Monmouth Air Force Base in the Dakotas, which also had nuclear warheads. I thought that would be the easiest way to find the man, so I contacted the historical officer for the Air Force Base, and within a few days he responded and said there was never such a man who was ever here at Monmouth Air Force Base. And I told the gentleman on the phone, I said, but I've got his military record in front of me, and it clearly states that he was there, what his rank was, what his duties were. It even had some information about small items of daily life, such as doctor appointments and things of that nature, leave slips. So I knew that the record was correct and accurate. But this gentleman at the Air Force Base assured me the man had never been posted there. So at that point I realized that somehow, for some reason, this gentleman had been totally removed from the military record as ever having been even existed as far as the United States Air Force was concerned. But one of the things that I did find was that he was one of the first graduates of U.S. Space Command, which some people claim to this day doesn't really exist. But I have his document showing that he is a graduate of U.S. Space Command. I think this gentleman's story, the deeper I get into it, the more interesting it becomes.
Place of rest, place of solace, a place of searching seek. One step at a time, marching down the darkening passage, the light diminishing with every step. The portal seals itself behind. The hope of peace no longer exists to find. Anticipation of the unknown only intensifies the terror.